I think this might have been a mistake. Hello everyone, are we back? Is the sound back yet, or am I just imagining things now? This is getting even more insane by the second. So we finally have a voice, which is nice. Today we're going to talk about 6 insane sites. I'm just going to start like we never really had that problem in the first place. Today we're going to talk about 6 sites that are actually quite perfect when it comes to the world of web, and I get to have a fresh start, which is incredible. I think we might have to trim this video after we're done, but with that said, let's just get started. Today's first site is oneworld1dollar.com, and the first and the most annoying part about this in its entirety is, as soon as you enter this site, as soon as you reload the experience, the first thing you get hit with is a model that says the game has ended. And if you're trying to be respectful, and if you're trying to get the entire experience, the game has ended is it's kind of a very, very negative way to start this entire site. And the only reason this even gets a mention in here in the first place is because it was interesting enough in the terms of its elements for it to actually work really well together. So with that said, I'm just going to talk about a couple of the things that work, the things that don't work, the things that actually leave you questioning the situation of this site as a whole. The first thing that works in my head very, very clearly is the fact that you have a bunch of elements that are actually very, very good on their own, and in their own worlds they work really well together. For example, you have a really, really fun 3D animated sphere that is entirely in the center and takes up the space it needs to. You have kind of an imprint of the words "One World, $1," which apparently seems to be the tagline, in the background, and it takes the space that it needs to, it gives the vibes that it needs to, it fades exactly as it's supposed to, and so that's where things actually start to work well for you. The whole headspace where we get into talking about numbers is a little bit overwhelming, to say the least, because the first most instinctive response for whoever was designing the site was to include all of the numbers that are very, very intriguing, and yet it went really, really stingy with the small font size of the large numbers, and you still don't know what's happening with any of these, and so this becomes a complicated, confusing mess of numbers and the word United States, and I still don't know what is happening unless you squint really, really hard. So that's kind of messed up. You have to squint hard to see anything at all, which is actually not the fun result fun that it sounds. It's not incredible, no matter what you think. You are again bombarded with a bunch of numbers, and I said these sites were perfect because from a design point of view you get to see how perfect they are, and yet there is some stuff that's just present as Easter eggs inside of over here, which is going to throw your balance off entirely. So you have a bunch of numbers that are just present, doing their own thing. No one knows what they do. Your shot at winning big, and I still don't know what my shot is. Like you have to squint really hard, think really big, and still not be able to understand what the game is. Was there even some rules here? Like it's kind of overwhelming as a whole. And then you get FAQs, which is actually where the site starts to appear normal at its very core. It just starts to be the most basic thing you'd want it to be. You have a normal accordion, and then this is where they kind of mess the whole design vibe over again. This vibe on its own would have been a really, really good idea as a light mode version of this site, and yet what we got instead is this really, really wide, weird looking pane, which is just present in the center of something that was supposed to be dark mode from the top, and now the only thing it looks like is a really, really weird, messy Google ad, which always cheapens the experience by a little bit, even if you think it doesn't. And then this is the area that I finally saw things actually coming together. This is even the area where the thumbnail for today's video comes from. You have your 3D model, even if present as an image, working well. You have some important text working for you, and then you have glassmorphism at the background of it all, tying things together. The footer for this site is quite simple. It looks plain, and yet it does a really good job of making things work really well together. So I think on an overall we could give this site a solid 5 out of 10. The reason I've changed my mind on this number so many times is because on the one hand, they get their principles, they get them to work right, and it's so close to what's perfect. But on the other hand, you have negative points as well. For example, there's a bunch of confusion in these numbers. The text is just too small, and then you don't have the right amount of white space, which might look like me being nitpicky, but at the end of the day, you have to understand that there is a dynamic that kind of works together with the whole thing, and when that's thrown off, it's very, very messy. Himanshu says it truly does look weird. It absolutely looks weird. Like, consider the optics of a site like this. It does throw your balance off a bit, even mentally. With that said, I will give the site a 5 out of 10. I do want to see what the next one is, because this is going to be an intriguing stream as we keep on going. The second site that we're talking about is a portfolio of Oscar Pico. Wow. Oscar Pico. I have no idea what the pronunciation is. This seems to be a Spanish site, so no matter what I do, it's going to be wrong. It's going to be not too perfect. And then so keeping my own personal insecurities about Spanish aside, you have a really, really simple site. You have all the elements that you would want on one site working well together. You have a background, you have some text, you have some elements, you hover over things, and it does change a little bit of an intrigue. There is negative space present, and they basically hijack your cursor to be able to see the text, that's to be able to see these images. I think what's weird here is it starts with slow scroll, take over your screen vibes parallax, and then it ends up becoming this entire slider inside of a one page website. So it just takes up its entire space. It's basically a slider, even though you think it isn't, and the only way to make it work is to scroll. So I think that's quite interesting. You can choose any of these if you'd want, and here's the fun part. I don't think it's working as we intend for it to, but also the fact that it's actually quite small and quite limited. So at this point, I'm still trying to understand what the site does, because the very first impression for me was it's a slider on a hero section on a landing page, and it gets quite boring really, really quickly. With that said, you have a bunch of text that's just present over here. You have all of these different links, all of these different information pieces on the info section, and yet it's just so much in one place that it starts looking really, really weird. I'm going to Playground with high hopes. This is actually where things start to look good, but for some reason they have this hidden inside of the page of Playground, which is actually messed up. It's messed up to say the least. You can keep on scrolling and you actually see some really weird parallax happen, and yet it doesn't happen. So I think that's just where things are kind of fusing together. That's definitely my interpretation of it. The page doesn't really scroll, the background is sticky, and yet you can choose the thing that you want to choose, and it'll show you this really weird image, which is kind of messed up, because you still have no idea what's happening. I think the site went wrong because you don't really know what the site does. Like, this should have been a little bit bigger, and this could have made do with being a little bit smaller. Like, you have no idea what this does, and it's a little bit weird because you don't get to pick up on the theme, even though it's a portfolio site. So a portfolio site needs to say what you do out loud, present there immediately, and when that doesn't happen, you know something's off balance. The third site that we're going to talk about is very animated, very, very fun, and I am not going to talk about this because it's definitely incredible. sloshceltizer.com. I think the animations for this really, really sold it for me. The color palette that they started working with didn't even have black and white for the hero section in the beginning, which is a very, very important part that they somehow missed out. But then you have green and pink, two very, very central colors, and then they end up tying the entire dynamic together, which was surprising. You can pop the top and it does a bunch of animations unload. I need to mute the site because I don't think we can have a lot of sound on these streams. Himanshu says 3JS. I do believe this is 3JS or any of the cool and fancy animation libraries, but this weird cursor hijack along with this dynamic definitely makes you think there is a little bit of an advanced programming side involved. I think the fun side of this entire dynamic is the fact that there's some cool design elements involved as well. So I think design is what really ties this together, and then 3JS is definitely a programming aspect in the implementation of the entire page. So I think the reason I wanted to draw attention to this is because you have so many illustrations, so much animation, so much motion go on in the real time, and also it's kind of incredible to be able to realize that you can have two simple colors, let them be there in the front of the screen and have them take up the entire space, and then they start to work with different two colors. So they kind of keep the pink that we were working with, but they switch around the greens and greens to red, and you have something that's really fiber like, because you're working with a liquid, and then it kind of animates exactly as it's supposed to. So that's definitely the cool aspect of this entire page. I think this third section is where things get really interesting, and I encourage you to try this out as well. When you start hovering, even if you're not hovering on anything at all, your cursor is basically hijacked to release a bunch of fruits on its own, which is definitely very weird, and it has all of these different names, and it has all of these different aspects, which definitely makes you think a very interesting experience. And this is not the kind of site that gets made because the programmer decided it. I think a lot of the decisions that go into making the site happen because there was very conscious UI UX design choice into getting what you're getting into right, and this is why it just works really well for me. This next is the can animation, which is actually quite incredible. When you start to scroll with this can, it changes colors as you're scrolling. It fits the vibe of whatever you're going for, and this is where I think actually things get really interesting. So you get these hands which are kind of cheering together. You know that Photoshop, no hands have veins this long, and yet I think the whole vibe and aspect that they're going for really does work well together. So the coolest thing with this site was the fact that it always stayed in motion, and when you're selling a liquid, it's kind of very visceral at that. So I think this is a site that really works well together. It shows you that you don't always need white and black to make good things happen. Any two colors will do. I think the overall animation is not just in the background but also in the foreground are what really sells this site to be a good site for me, and I want to talk about a couple of things that just really work well together here. The reason this site looks very overwhelming and it's actually quite simple to make is just this. So I want to talk about why this site looks really complicated and why it's like the simplest thing in the whole world. Number one, you have a bunch of animated icons in the background that are hovering, taking up their own space, and yet at the same time they're animating above, which is opposite of the animation below that happens with the liquid. And I'm talking about animations happening above in the background, and that's significant simply because when you have motion that's dragging a side down, it makes sense to have a counter to that in order to have some amount of balance. And if you know what I mean, if you've done sites with animations, I think you already know what I'm talking about. When you have a bunch of things that are going down strategically, even by gravity, it makes sense to have something that lifts the vibe up, whether it's a gradient, whether it's an animation, whether it's motion. So I think that's exactly where the site starts to fill itself, take its own space and work well together. I think when you have a bunch of animated illustrated icons and then you have a bunch of really wide taking up their own space kind of texts, I think that's where the entire vibe starts to get good. The only thing with this site that's working is this site can be like broken down into 4 different elements. Number one, constant motion or animation, whatever you need to make it work. Number 2, you have a very liquidy feel, and then you're going to your hardest efforts to make sure that fiber kind of remains. Number 3, I think the reason this site really works well together is because you have 2 colors, never white and black, which is opposite to what many people think, never white and black, and you have these colors work really well together. So I think that's exactly where these things start to work really well for you, and the fact that there is always motion is exactly what ensures this dynamic where even when you're bored of the site, you're introduced to this weird game sort of a thing where every time you hover over anything at all, or even if you don't, fruits are constantly generated. So I think that's really a fun visceral way of bringing what you're thinking to the top. You can shoot your shot to find a flavor, which I have a really hard time doing. You can click and hold to release. I have no idea what's going on now. Wow, this is another game inside of a game. So you can have the entire wide field by the beer pong gamey vibe, because making this is actually very, very simple if you know the right gaming tools, and yet imagining it is just an idea that would never ever reach you from the point of user experience. So that's exactly where I'm coming from at this site. The first thing that happens is you have a bunch of cups, and then you have to select any one of these cups, let them fill up, and it just does this really, really cool splash of an animation. Let's it take its space. Sometimes it doesn't work though, which is definitely what's throwing my balance off a little bit, and it's kind of hard to understand. So with that said, the only couple of elements that make the site work well together is they've taken not just one color palette, but a bunch of two colored color palettes, and then they've used a bunch of really, really wide in your face texts. There is no explanation that happens. It's just, this is my brand, this is my name, this is my color, this is my vibe, take it. There is motion happening and there's animation happening, and if you make the list, it's really a bunch of really, really small rules that are just very, very simple and packed as one, and used really, really well to a point where you actually start to see the efficacy of the entire endeavor as a whole. With that said, there is a lot of motion and there is a lot of fun stuff that you can do with dynamics like this. When you start to work with motion that is very, very liquidy and very, very kind of substance based, you can have it go for an underwater theme, and you can have, stuff that's under the water, you can have stuff that's kind of in the air. So when you have a lot of motion go on with anything at all, I think that's when it becomes really easy to animate and go into the worlds that you're going into. So for example, this is some beverage that they're selling, and so they really want to go in that direction, and having the kind of liquid fiber vibe really works well together with that entire endeavor. And I think you don't really have to work as hard to get this kind of an animation to work, even if it seems kind of counterintuitive, because you have a bunch of rules, and then you have there be a little bit of motion, and you play your cards right at that, and it kind of becomes a simple 9 out of 10 site on its own. The reason I want to take 1 point off is because I was really happy when this game started to play, and yet it's really complicated and sometimes doesn't work, which is disappointing after engaging a user. So I think that's where actually genuine users start to fall out, and that's where things start to mess with your head. The next site that we're going to talk about is going to be axlab.com, and they're very, very clear with what they're doing. They're very, very simple, which is actually what I like about them. We create meaningful technologies that people feel present, connected in virtual worlds for gaming, training, simulation, and more. And I think this is where this entire site starts to work well together. You have a lot of motion go on. As I'm scrolling this downwards, it's kind of still scrolling horizontally, which is actually fine, because a lot of the times when you have something animated, the need to have it work well together is kind of ingrained, and this really does work well together with the entire theme of kind of reinventing the wheel, which is what this brand is about, and you can tell that immediately. You have a lot of white space, you have a lot of these really, really cool images, you have the ability to not put a single line rectangle as a border, and I think that's what ties this dynamic together. So you have these rounded rectangles, and you have these kind of cut up squares which are in their own worlds, but they do work with the whole gamer vibe, and they do tie the whole experience together better than you would know. Now what's confusing me is this does not seem to work. Wow. As soon as you click on any of these elements, it just takes you to this really, really simple page where you have a bunch of links and a bunch of really simple text descriptions, and then you have their cyberpunk old school gaming vibes footer, which is very, very plain, and then you take the entire dynamic of, this is my brand name, I'm going to put this in the footer, and I'm going to make this work. And I think that's just what ties this entire experience very, very simply together. So with that said, is this a good site? Quite possibly. Is this the perfect site in the world? No, it's not. And then you actually start to see where it starts to get its good points. So for example, when you start with the index and you have to go to the index, this index is for some reason not the homepage, which is what's blowing my mind now. We are a virtual reality company in technology, and it just keeps on going black and white, which makes you think your device is not working properly when it's actually quite good. So with that said, they really, really work well to animate and get the colors and get the elements really, really slowly together. And I'm surprised at why this wasn't the landing page in the first place. Either I was opening something wrong, or we've not seen enough of this site. So I think a couple of elements here that we really need to talk about are, you have these borders and you have them present in the background, and they take up the space that they need to, and then suddenly, as I'm talking 5 minutes into this site, I get surprised with a background video which was either too big to load, or it was just not optimized enough to be accessible to most heavy duty devices even, which is exactly what's blowing my mind now. Wow, we have some weird sound echoes going. With that said, there is a lot of white space, and there is a lot of elements with their own distinct borders, and white space is the only thing they don't mess up here, which is why the site becomes a solid 8 out of 10. I think the part that I'm struggling with is very, very easy endeavor was made to just bombard you with text, and I think that just happens really, really quickly. There's text here, and there isn't enough relief for there to be any understanding at all. And I think that's exactly where this site becomes overkill for me. So 8 out of 10, because there is a ton of effort that went into making the vibe last, and yet it's just a little bit finicky in terms of how perfect it is, simply because you just get bombarded into text as soon as you go onto the hero page, to the point where it becomes hard to break down and review, because there is just everything packed into everything together. With that said, the last hero section that we just saw accidentally on the index page with the whole text vibe is also a simple similarity with this next site that we're talking about, which is localstudio.france, and it's a bunch of words, and it's a bunch of links, and it's a bunch of really, really simple coins and stuff, and it has this comic old school vibe which works well with the comic old school energy of this entire site, which is very, very on brand, very, very perfect at that. You have your images, you have your crazy text be there in front of the screen, and it tells you what they do right in front of your face. You have a lot of white space, which really does take its own area on its own, and then you have these really weird dudes with a bunch of color that I'm now unnerved by, because I'd never in 100 years expected to see a comic with orange faces. So I think that's where I start to have some dissonance in my own head. But then you have a lot of text, and you have it be present enough, and you have it show enough side of their personality that it actually starts to be really, really reliable and really, really fun, and it is a wonderful brand banner, to say the least. And I'm saying banner and not a site, because it's this doesn't have a level of interactivity that we kind of expected. Yes, there is parallax. Yes, they change the background colors every single time something gets boring. Yes, the text does present itself wherever it needs to, and yet it's kind of very, very one dimensional and very, very simple. I do want to see if something fun happens with the studio, and it's arguable that this section actually shows more personality than the entire landing page. Reason being, the landing page only had actual images and only had actual text. It didn't even have descriptions about the people who are behind, which is surprisingly the theme of this brand. So I think the first page was called banner because there is not enough description to be able to relaxedly call this an actual landing page, and I think that's what starts to happen when you actually go to the studio section. I love the fact that they've just kept the white and black theme going, and then suddenly you are hit with a bunch of blue, which takes the whole palette off of the plain black and white, and it takes you back to their simple footer, which is just once again taking the title of the brand, using it at the top of the footer, and then including an image if they want to. So it kind of seems really, really big in terms of personality, but its entire breakdown is very, very simple, and I think they've had a bunch of playground examples as well, where you can actually see what they're actually doing. This is very, very old time jQuery has just come in vibes, which was a fun era on its own, but again a bunch of really cool images that you can open up when you start to click on these. I have no idea what's actually happening. Wow, how can I close this off? This seems to be a gallery for the same exact brand, and yet it opens up wherever it wants to, or maybe when it opens up when I click. So I think there's communication gap, because you don't know what's happening and when it's happening. But that said, it's a super cool attempt for a site, and yet it's funny, and it's weird in its own space. Kubair Mehta says, you might like my site if you're taking recordings. Please send me over your site on any of these live chats, and we'll definitely take a look. With that said, let's go to the last site for today, which is proof IO, and it's very very simple, it's very very clean, and that's what fits the dynamic of what we're doing really really well together. You have a background image that takes its own space, but you also have a bunch of white space. I think the thing that just shifts in my head with this entire page is now you have no fancy fonts, no fancy text, nothing to shift your focus to when you're looking for some level of personality. It's very very plain, very very simple, and yet it does have a lot of motion to it, so you're constantly looking with the text and the way it moves. You have a bunch of images, you have a bunch of icons, you show your description. This is like the most, and I'm not talking a lot about this section because this seems like the most common AI generated now section that there is. And then you have a simple section divider that changes the way you're looking at things, but I think the real synchronicity starts to kick in with the site when you go to the bottom, where you actually start to see these cards look not only very very simple together, but also very very great in terms of consistency. So I think that's where they really really do a good job, and this entire section works because you have simple text, you have simple images, but these images are of the same theme and it's immediately visual. You have a bunch of reasons to choose this brand, and they're very very simple in terms of their footer as well, which is fine. Overall, have to give this site a 7 out of 10 because on paper they get everything right, and that pizzazz is inherently missing. What does this at the end of everything, at the end of seeing the site, the only question that remains is, what does this site prove? And I think in my head it proves that if you can get a site right, as for as long as it continues, if you can get the simple aspects right, you can actually come up with something really really decent, something that even ends up on the major light boom platforms like Awwwards, and it does work well together especially if you're going into that vibe. So with that said, those were 6 sites, ladies and gentlemen. Today we talked about 6 incredible sites that just really really change your perception of what the web is right now. And this has been me today. I will see you again tomorrow 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time or 3:30 p.m. GMT. If you like this stream, make sure to leave a comment. I will see you